Hi, ladies and gentlemen. This is our introduction to the ACT Science, the final test of the ACT. On the ACT Science, they're going to ask you to be able to read and interpret charts, graphs, and data as though you were a scientist. However, it is essentially a reading test, and you can answer most or all of the questions without any previous background because the answers are contained on the test. The test is 35 minutes and 40 questions, much like the ACT reading. However, it does not have a standardized amount of questions per passage. Instead, it has 6 to 7 passages of any number of questions that will lead you to getting 40 done in 35 minutes. One of the challenges is that the pacing is a little bit harder on the ACT Science because the passages do not all have the same types of questions. There are 3 different types of passages on the ACT Science. They are unmarked, but understanding what they are will help you to tackle them. One is conflicting viewpoints. That's this first passage here. In conflicting viewpoints, you have different students or different scientists who agree or disagree on various reasons for why things are happening. So, for instance, you may have a lake that's drying up, and scientist 1 thinks it's because of global warming, and scientist 2 thinks it's because of industrial factors like a new factory. You're to, in those passages, answer questions about how they agree and disagree and how their views differ. So the conflicting viewpoints passage is one of comparison and contrast. The next type of passage is the data representation passage as well as the experiments passage. So the experiments passages, you're going to see study 1, study 2, or experiment 1 or experiment 2. And essentially, they're going to give you some data that scientists have collected to determine something. In this case, they're determining the various materials that make up the Jupiter moon Io. And so they have a number of observations, and you are to compare and contrast the various different observations to determine what different materials compose the surface of Io. And so these kinds of questions ask you to compare and contrast various different pieces of data, to think like a scientist in order to put yourself in their shoes if they were doing this experiment, and to make determinations based on the results of their experiments, and generally the kinds of things that a science classroom would ask you to do. Finally, we have data representation. And data representation is essentially exactly what it says. So, for instance, here we have a chart with how different masses of items, from food to sugar to chemical compounds, and we're to determine how they interact with each other. In other words, you're going to be spending a lot of time thinking about the different heat released of these different substances and how they compare and contrast. The data representation passages are essentially supposed to be little excerpts from a textbook that you could answer questions about. Experiments haven't necessarily been done with any purpose, but this data can be used to make certain assumptions or hypotheses, and the passage is going to ask you to do that. Now, some of the key strategies on these passages are as follows. First, many of the passages have lots of different things to look at. So for instance, here we have Table 1 and we have Figure 2. Well, one of the things that you can do is answer all of the questions about one part of the test at a time. So one of the most important things you could do for yourself is to break it up into its little parts so you don't get overwhelmed. In other words, you should answer in this one all the questions about Table 1, then you should answer all the questions about Figure 2, and then you can move on to questions about both or ones that compare both. That way you're just focused on one thing at a time, you don't get overwhelmed, and even if it's a struggle, it is a focused struggle. You're focused on one part of it rather than jumping back and forth between lots of different confusing places and getting a little bit off on your answering. And so that's one of the things that you can do to try to divide it up. For instance, this talks about Figure 1 first. You may want to wait on that one and skip to this one about Table 1 because you want to do all the questions about one thing at a time. The other thing is that if the passage happens to be about something you already know a little bit about, it's going to tend to be a lot easier for you. So here we have one about forest fragmentation. You probably don't know a lot about that, but maybe you do know a lot about how we assess calories. And so this bomb calorimeter one, this assessing how much heat is released to determine how many calories are happening, perhaps you did an experiment of that in one of your other classes, and you might have a little bit of context that'll make this a little bit faster for you. Those are the basic ideas about the ACT Science. We'll be going more in depth in class, but for now, I want you to think about the fact that the ACT Science is the same length and amount of questions as the ACT Reading, that it has, however, more passages than the ACT Reading, so it's a little bit harder to pace yourself, and the most important thing is to break it up into its smaller parts, doing one part of the science data at a time, like doing all the questions for Figure 1 before moving on to all the questions about Figure 2, in order to break apart complex, multi-table, multi-chart passages in a way that's palatable that you can be successful. In class, we'll pick it up from there. I hope you enjoyed this ACT Science review and feel like you know a little bit more about it. Have a good day.